Kate has recently translated Lily is Crying, which is newly published. A novel by Helene Bessette, I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, a novelist I knew nothing about until recently, so it's great to have this. And Jen, I think yesterday or today or tomorrow, this is officially published. So you can buy the advanced copies of the Life Art of Translation at the back. There are many, many other texts that both of the authors have either written or translated. And of course, one of the questions today, I assume, will be the lines between writing and translation. The way this will function is we are not going to I'm not going to chair. Instead, Jen and Kate will engage in a conversation for approximately an hour, perhaps slightly over an hour, and we'll then open it to the floor for questions, which they will take as well. I wanted to just finish with some thank yous, so I don't have to do that at the end, at the point at which everybody wants to get a glass of wine. To thank, first of all, Siobhan, who has put the event together, to thank City Books, who have kindly agreed to come and bring the books here, and to thank my colleagues, Joe, Liam, and others who've supported this event, to welcome colleagues from Cambridge and from other parts of the country who've come today, and in particular to thank the two of you for agreeing to come. With the help of the wonderful publishers Fitzcarraldo, and there are a number of Fitzcarraldo books there as well. So I will say no more. I'm going to turn over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to open and start by saying thank you for that beautiful introduction. I think we're both really delighted to be held under this contested phrase of the cartography of the political novel in Europe. We're both actually really delighted to have this event together, which is our first event, which is a bit remarkable really, given that we've been corresponding and meeting, every couple of years or so for pretty much since 2017. So this is very special for us. Special for Jen, who's local, somewhat local. Special for me because I used to live in Brighton. This is the city I moved to when I left home. And so there's very dear people in the room. There's lots of people we don't know, but there are people who are very dear to us in the room. So thank you for coming. So I want to start, maybe just start with a reference to yesterday when I was on the train. I live in Rotterdam and I was on the train to come here for this event, and also for tomorrow where there's a launch in London for the translation, which you mentioned, Lily is Crying by Helene Bessette. And I was feeling the nerves, I was feeling this kind of weight of responsibility, which you do as a translator, which is quite different to writing your own books, because you are rewriting a book that someone else has written in a different context. You're renewing it, you're againin it, you're producing a new context for it. And I was feeling, nervous about coming and doing this and being public in this moment. But I also had Jen's book, Fair, The Life Art of Translation, with me, and I was rereading it, and was this injection of joy at what Jen's given us in this book, which you're going to hear from in a moment, which is so lucid on so many things, maybe particularly on the working conditions of translators, like what it is. You mentioned translation is important in the sense of it makes books available to read that we might otherwise not have a chance to read. But how do these translations actually get written, and by whom, and under what conditions, under what material conditions do they get written? Jen's so lucid and astute on this, and mournful in some ways, in some places, and resistant and angry in other places, but also so full of kind of purpose and possibility. So I just felt energized on the train and able to come and do what I needed to do. So I wanted to thank you, Jen, for this extraordinary book, which was reviewed in The Observer just this Sunday by Anthony Cummins and called Audacious, Polemical, and Essential. So, three good words. We like Anthony Cummins a lot. It's called Fair. There's a very particular set of reasons why it's called Fair, which you're going to kind of hear about by inviting Jen just to read from the first pages, and then we'll talk more about this rationale for the title. So, please, Jen.
That was an introduction, Kate. And just to echo what Kate said, this is like a dream come true for me to be here with Kate, who I'm going to also be mapping out how FAIR came, directly after this little art. But yeah, first I'm just going to read the first couple of pages of FAIR to give you an idea of, what the hell it's about. So the first section is called Welcome, Glossary of Terms, Terms and Conditions. I've been working on something spectacular. Have you ever been to a book fair, an art fair? How about a fun fair? Those vast constellations in exhibition centres the size of aircraft carriers, or akin to airports with their own escalators and travelators, or in custom-made tents the size of a giant's wedding marquee, or a garish sprawl of gaudy attractions and hazardous-looking rides. Wildly different to zine fairs in community halls or in the back rooms of pubs, the print fairs in cafes and shop basements, or the little cartoon vehicles for kids in supermarkets that gently rock you back and forth. Art fairs and book fairs dissect cavernous floor space into room-sized, how big is a room, cubicles, where you, the visitor, suspend your disbelief. You're not in a huge hall with voices ricocheting around and raining down on you like you're in an underground cave. You're in a calm gallery. You're in a private office, shouting with your face, but whispering. A cubicle or stand might be a simple white box with 3 walls and a patch of carpet or faux wooden floor, a few paintings or sculptures on plinths, a desk and chairs and some shelves displaying books. It might have a Technicolor pond dotted with glitter sunken mysteriously into the floor, or a giant inflatable Felix the cat. The big galleries like to show off and create immersive spaces like a perfect recreation of an artist's studio, or an interactive game like an uncanny fairground experience. Big name houses take up twice, thrice, 4 times, 8 times the floor plan of other presses, with columns, huge billboards, the dazzle and potential of a roller coaster. Sudden happenings like dances, provocations, roving parades and people in costume occur in the spaces between or in front of the stands, appearing and disappearing as if in a dream. The whole thing is one big performance. These places aren't serious, spacious pantheons of trade. They're circus tops, fairground, fairy tale, mirage. It's like when the fair rolls into town. I think of these fairs like pop-up theatres, pop-up shops. When I was interviewed to work on the information desk at a big week-long art fair pitched up in a vast park the summer after graduating from my postgrad degree, I was asked by the interviewer to describe what an art fair is. I said that it was kind of like a big supermarket. There are aisles upon aisles of stands where gallerists display their goods, only without the trolleys. The interviewer didn't like this answer. I didn't get the job. But then I did get the job in the end. They didn't have enough people to turn anyone down. It was a tiring job where I had to deal with a lot of rude, entitled people who wouldn't look at me as they asked where the VIP lounge was, and would walk off, toot the suite once they had their answer, to quaff the champagne laid on by the sponsor. The next year, my friend, who managed the guided tours, asked if I would like to curate and lead tours around the art fair instead. I did this for 3 consecutive summers. I walked around the not yet fair a couple of days before the grand opening, picking pieces I found the most interesting, researching them, then planned my route. The fair would still be in an unfinished state. Lost my place. The fair would still be in an unfinished state, planks of wood and offcuts of tape littering the aisles, and last-minute changes would occur. I would come in early each day to make sure one of the pieces on my tour hadn't been sold or swapped overnight, an eerie feeling to walk up to one of the stands and find everything as it was, yet one of the pieces transformed into something else, or a doorway moved to a different side of a stand, like an enchanted labyrinth. The tours would last an hour, and I would perform them. They really were a performance, 3 to 6 times a day. I would wear a head mic, and as I led them around the packed fair, the tour groups would listen to me speaking on headphones plugged into transmitters on lanyards set to my frequency. Sometimes they would listen avidly and ask questions. Others would half listen, some would chat the whole time, a few would wander off or hand me back the equipment while I was mid-flow because they had spotted someone they knew, or the tour wasn't what they had expected. Maybe you will do the same. I would sometimes lie down under the information desk between tours and close my eyes. It was exhausting. The bigger publishers at book fairs have doors on their stands that lead into private broom-cupboard offices. I've power napped in one of those too. It's like being underwater, a hot, noiseless, airless pocket in a ship's hull, a cruise liner of interactions, activities, and entertainment. I can remember how disorientating a big fair can be. The noise, the lack of air, how overcrowded it is, the feeling that you're getting ill, fair flu on the horizon. The way that the stands and cubicles appear open to all, but are actually strangely closed. For most of them, you need an appointment, and yet you're not sure how to get one. Stick with me, I'll look after you.
Cheers. That's the introduction to a book which very seriously, very concretely and consequentially is structured like a fair. So, and Jen is indeed our guide wearing a head mic. And so there are interactive games, there's a confetti gun, there's a lot that I can't summarize, you really need to read the book. All in the service of opening up, sharing with us what this practice of translation, this life art of translation, your beautiful, subtitle makes clear. So I remember hearing you talk about this project, I think before, I'm not sure how many pages were written then, where this conceit of the fairgrounds, and I really like how it moves from, have you been to a book fair? Like, probably not, like how many in an audience, and kind of audience you're addressing, and the kind of audience you want the book to address, which is a very open demographic. Like, have you been to a book fair? Maybe a few have. You've been to an art fair? Maybe a few. Fun fair? Yeah, probably. And it's like that's the spirit of the book, of like, how can you draw us into something that's recognizable? But my first question to you is how long was that strategy or that structuring principle there for you?
So from the very beginning, I knew that it was going to be in a physical space, like a memory palace, because often my preoccupation when I'm reading something is, but where is this taking place? So where is the person speaking? Is it in a room? Are they outside? Are they having a walk? And when I had decided that it had to be contained, I also knew very much that it had to be playful, it had to be fun, that I had to try and lure people in that do not care about literary translation or like the working conditions of freelancers. It had to be something that would entertain people, because on paper initially the information is dry. How do you get somebody to want to know about how you're commissioned as a freelance literary translator? It's like, obviously you turn it into an arcade game. And initially the structure was going to be a tower with a lift. So right from the beginning, I don't know if anyone has seen the children's show Nightmare that was on kind of like in the 80s and 90s, where players had to go up and down on a lift, and every floor there was like quite horrifying games. It was a very mysterious program, and I thought a tower is perfect because it's like you start at the bottom, you go to the top. But as I got deeper into the project, and this was, I think I was working on it for 5 years all in all, I realised that structure was just falling into the trap of linear memoir. This idea of you start with nothing and now look at all these achievements and look how successful I am. But I felt very unsuccessful. I felt like I had failed because my, I was barely sustaining myself as a literary translator and a writer, even though I was working sometimes 7 days a week. So something was going wrong, and I really didn't feel like it was going to be this like bottom to top story. And then I had a conversation with my partner, and he just came up with the concept of the fair and was like, you spend all your time at these these weird book fairs, or like and he's an artist and very, very interested in art, and had obviously attended art fairs and worked at an art fair. And so this seemed like the perfect memory palace because it is flat. So it's not that one experience helps you gain height. It's, you're always on the same level. Sometimes you go in the basement. There is a basement. So that's where the structure came from. And then in terms of the fun fair, I've kind of covered that it was really to inject some humour in it. But that's the form it took, and it helped me let go of this very standard way of telling a life by breaking it up. But in terms of actually it being located in a space, and also it being located often in domestic space and fantasy kind of collective space, I really was inspired so much by this little art. And most people in this room will know this, but this little art, when it came out in 2017, it completely exploded how people could actually access what literary translation is. It helped people rethink what they thought literary translation is. It introduced a whole new metrics for how we were thinking about literary translation. But in terms of how it affected literary translators, even the other day I was talking to a friend who's also a literary translator, and she mimicked swooning at the mention of this book, this many years on, because it really did, it really activated a lot of people and gave a lot of people the confidence and the courage to write their personal story of translation and to see a way into it in such a oblique way. And no one was reading anything like this, and it was the book that everyone could finally say, please read this book, because this really does explain the experience of it. So would you like to read a little bit?
Oh, right, thank you, Jen. I just lost it. Thank you, Jen. Thank you.
Right?
Yeah, very, very. That's extraordinary to hear. Thank you. I'm going to read a very brief passage from this little art called Don't Do Translations. And funnily enough, I remembered, this has been my reading copy since 2017, and in the idea, in later printings, the don't is struck through, so it reads like don't, like do translations, and that's the kind of invitation of the book of like, do them, start doing them, like let's move away from this idea that a certain level of expertise or authority needs to be achieved before this practice can begin. But in the very first printing of this book, we who were involved in making it, because books are collaborative productions, forgot to strike through the don't. So, which is also just a sign, I think, of some of the things we're interested in, of the ways that transformation can happen through these. Are they errors, or are they just sort of serendipities? Anyway, I was reminded of this, but this is called Don't Do Translations, with the emphasis on the do afterwards. Don't do translations, I remember being advised about a decade ago, so now longer, by a well-meaning professor. At least not if you're planning on making a living, or let's say on getting a job in the university. It's a thankless thing, really. A little art, Helen Lowe Porter called it, despite the great determining resonance her own work would have. You could try writing a monograph instead, perhaps a monograph about translation, but don't spend your time, and certainly not all your time, on doing them. The first time I heard the word monograph, I wasn't exactly sure what it meant. The dictionary offers a learned treatise on a small area of learning, or a written account of a single thing, which makes things difficult because translating is not a small area of learning, and nor is a translation ever an uncomplicatedly single thing. But it turns out that academics use the word to mean something different, making the mono, the just one, refer not to the subject matter, which might be a vast area of learning or a book about many things, but to how the book is written. A monograph is a book written by just one person, a singly authored original contribution to knowledge. Don't do translations, he said, a decade or so ago. Not if you want. Well, what exactly? What exactly did I want? Now I think of it, a different question might have been, what is it that you have found in the practice of translation? That is, in the writing of literary translations. Since among all the many instances of translation currently happening everywhere and all the time in the world, this is the form that your activity seems to take. What is it about this activity, in its difference from single-handed original authorship, the way it complicates the authorial position, sharing it, usurping it, sort of dislocating it, by the way it gets things said and written, heard and read nonetheless, by these other, more distributed means? What is it about the practice of writing translations, and how, in whose terms exactly, do you propose to properly register what's going on with this, with your, with my, with our work? So that was the kind of question I was setting myself, like what is it? What is it that I was finding interesting about translation, compelling and captivating about translation, formative about translation, and generative about translation, despite the material circumstances, which you talk so eloquently about and lay bare. Maybe I'd just like to come back briefly, before we get to excitement and desire and education and research and development and collaboration and writing and all these things that a practice of translation is and is doing. You said earlier you felt that you'd failed. That's why you didn't have your tower model or your arc of progress. And there's a really powerfully moving moment in the book where you lay it bare, like what translators get paid and the circumstances under which they do their work is actually not sustainable for a life. And the difference, and that spoke to me very, very strongly as someone who doesn't, my livelihood is not through translation. I teach, as you know, I'm a part-time tutor in an art school. I also won a literary lottery. I won a major prize. But I too, between translation and writing and winning the literary lottery, which only happens once in a lifetime, I too can't do without the stability of my part-time tutor position. I can't make it work from my writing and my translations. So there is this gap between what success might look like, or a kind of visibility might look like, and what it actually looks like in terms of how you pay your bills, how you clothe yourself, how you imagine a future. So I wonder if you could, that laying bare felt like a very vulnerable moment, because these are the kinds of things that we're not supposed to talk about directly, because we're supposed to feel grateful for the fact that we're enabled and been given spaces like this to do creative work and to talk about creative work. But could you talk some more about that?
Yeah, so again, it was really interesting the further I got into the book, or writing the book, how much anger there was. And I think one person that read it a bit earlier on said that it felt like it was powered by rage, which was and my response was like, I don't see what's wrong with that, because any kind of emotion that keeps you going on a writing project is a good one. And I think the anger and the rage comes from a real frustration that, whereas initially the sense of failure was I pushed it myself. It's something I have done. I haven't worked hard enough. I haven't picked the projects well enough. I should have haggled harder on the individual contract, etc. The deeper it got, the more I started thinking about, that idea of if translation is art, not all artists can guarantee to have a sustainable career, right? Or writers even. And I often say I've made this huge mistake that my 50% of my work is literary translation, 50% is writing with some teaching, so therefore it's 100% shit. It's like I did try to have a proper job, but I couldn't do it. And the fact of the matter is, this is the kind of work that sustains me as a person. I wake up every day and my first thought is, what am I going to create, be it translation or writing or other ways, or teaching. And then I realised I was angry at the structures and the publishing industry to a degree, because it's not a question. I think there's a conflation that goes on where it's the question of you know, as a creative person, you're not guaranteed work. But then what is the problem then if I have guaranteed work and I've had a lot of work and I'm working constantly and it's still not sustaining me? So, you know, it's separating those arguments. And, you know, I've worked for independent publishers and small presses, but then also very large publishing houses, and I have got paid the same in all of them. And the smallest publishing house I ever worked for paid me the only bonus I've ever received as a thank you. So then what is happening there? And so I think this isn't just translation, it's the publishing industry, it's the creative industries, and a big part of the book is, you know, widening that lens and being like, it's not a translation problem, it's not a me problem, it's a systemic problem, and it's across all of the creative industries. And I think so many people can relate to that. So it's also bringing in ghostwriters, artists, people that work in the theatre. And again, it's why the fair is so multimodal, because it's saying, why are we not talking together? And, you know, it's creating that fantasy space of why are there not discussions where it's people across loads of different creative industries all saying, none of us are surviving, and why is that? But also in this little art, you also engage with the materiality of translators, and also fundamentally with the living translator. So, you know, one of the big issues is the translator only, previously the translator has only existed for the length of a job, and then they disappear. You know, a translator is always hopping from job to job to job, and in the middle, nobody's looking after you, nobody emails you, you don't exist, even though your life continues. And I think what's so wonderful in this little art is you were saying, let's go and have a look at the lives of these translators. Let's see what they were living while they were translating, and how that linked so fundamentally to the translation project and influenced it. What made you want to engage with, say, Helena Porter and Dorothy Bussey and bring in these forebearers of translation, into this little art, which also very much influenced my own mode of bringing in other people? So yeah, what led to that?
Thank you. That's a great. It was quite a kind of pragmatic solution, in the sense it might, to answer the question straightforwardly, there was this impulse to try and make the translator appear and her work, the work, and so how to do that, given, as we all know, I think that as readers of translations, that we have that sense of we're moving straight through mediation to the thing itself. I think translation's also in some way complicit in that, in the sense of that's what we're trying to do. You talk about this very eloquently. We're trying, I think, is it Maureen Freely who says to you, "Oh, Jen, you've got it. The translation of a story is a story." So, you're trying to make a composition that has the kind of energy and in forms of engagement and so on that can give the illusion of a thing being, of a composition that works and is readable and has the qualities of literature. So I wanted to make this sort of second person if this is a form of collaboration or group work, like who's in the group. But that felt like such a vast, to start writing about translation is such a vast field, really, like what you start to, as you have, you start thinking about what is not relevant to translation actually. Like how do I kind of limit this to an extent that a book can start to be written? And I was very bewildered and overwhelmed for a really long time. But the solution I found was just to kind of work with what was on my table. And where was my table? So the way you started, when you read, you think about what kind of space was that. There was a desk by a window in a room, in a flat in Paris that overlooked some parkour action that appears in the book. And there were children's toys in the room also. And there were also certain books on my desk, and the reason for Helen Lowe Porter is because I was translating at that time lecture courses by Roland Barthes, as you know, and one of the lecture courses is called How to Live Together. And in that lecture course, Barthes has an interesting collection of novels that he puts together, one of which is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Another is a work by André Gide, which was translated by Dorothy Bussey. So I had those books on my desk, which I needed to read in order to translate the lecture course. And the lecture course was also speaking back to me. I mean, Barthes was declared as being like wholly uninterested in translation. He says this somewhere of like, but I felt this question of how to live together, that being a kind of rhythm problem, that being a kind of a collaboration problem, a co-writing problem. I felt like he was offering me terms for thinking about translation, and also leading me to these translators who'd facilitated my reading of German, let's say, because I don't read German. So if I could read The Magic Mountain, it was because of Helen Lowe Porter. And it so happened that Helen Lowe Porter had relatively recently in the late 90s or so, come into for huge kind of criticism for the translations that she'd published, which really introduced Thomas Mann's body of work into America and to a kind of Anglophile reading public. She really dedicated a huge portion of her life to translating Thomas Mann, only for after her death for her translation to be deeply criticised, and so I was really interested in that story, and it wasn't so much about, I mean, there were lots of readings of This Little Art when it came out, and one of them was, one very prominent one was, this celebration of translators is wholly uninterested in rigor, is about celebrating mistakes don't matter. Helen Lowe Porter, this kind of celebration of Helen Lowe Porter in the book is misguided because we've since had better translations, more rigorous translations of Thomas Mann, which felt to me like it missed the point entirely. What I was interested in is that she actually had quite a lot to say about her practice. I think often as translators you can get this question of like, what were you thinking? Like, what were you thinking with that decision? As if you weren't thinking at all. And the point is that like we are thinking, and Helen Lowe Porter was thinking in the circumstances in which she was living. So what she was able to write was a product of her thinking and her circumstances, and it was an extraordinary product. It's like, it was a novel. I encountered The Magic Mountain in her translation. I didn't have another one to compare it to, and I had a very powerful aesthetic, philosophical experience. So that's a kind of long answer to say, like, the reason why these particular stories, of all the stories I could tell, including my own, are in there was because they were what I had to hand, and these were the materials I then decided to try and activate. But that to handness actually leads on to a question that I wanted to ask you, because a friend of mine who's here, who's an artist and works a lot with weaving and makes baskets, is a basket maker, among other things. She read this early on and wrote to me and said, Kate, you've written a book about baskets. And I have in my memory, and I have to check this with Anne-Marie whether this is true, but I have even a memory of her sending me a page where she just crossed out a page, and every time I'd written translation, she put baskets. I don't know if I've invented this, I hope it's true. Because the way that she's working with received gestures, that's such a deep part of her practice, is that this basket shape that she's making right here and now has been made before. Mm-hmm. That's the point. She's working with something that does already exist. It's a derivative practice. That's the point. It's kind of unoriginal, and that's the point. But it's a continuation of a set of gestures and a refinding of an energy in, and a containing quality, a holding quality in a form, and making it again. And so I was so delighted that this book could speak outside of two other forms of material making that weren't only translating. And it feels like that's really important to your book too. I'm thinking especially about when you talk about your relationship with your father, and could you talk a bit about this, about the forms of making that are happening alongside your work, and how you see this connecting to other practices?
Yeah, so, when I was reading Handiwork by Sarah Baum, she talks, and this is something that definitely should have gone in my book, and it's one of those things that I remembered after they hit print, and you're like, Sarah Bell. But she talks about discovering that the models that her grandfather had made of carriages, like wooden carriages, were actually kits you could send away for, that he hadn't originally made, all these little components of the carriage, and it was actually, a set of instructions and all the bits, and then he put it together, and that she initially felt cheated by that, but then was like, why not? What that is a kind of creativity, and it's a generative creativity, and I think partly from reading that book, but then also during lockdown, I got really into making salt dough ornaments of fake food, which I talk about at length in the book. And what I do is initially, I talk about my instinct to intellectualize it. So, aha, this is a metaphor for translation. And then I try and undercut it a bit, because not everything can be translation or intellectualized, and maybe it's better to keep it separate. To be like, no, it's just me making fake fried chicken out of salt dough and painting it. But I did find during lockdown, so in the book I talk about, I'm half Maltese and my dad is from Malta, and grew up trilingual with Maltese, Italian and English, but me and my brother were brought up monolingually. And how in my early 30s, that kind of Maltese loss kind of kicked in, after not really realising I'd got into languages because I hadn't been brought up in a multilingual household, and then hitting my 30s and being like, why didn't I learn Maltese? Again, what were the reasons behind that? And then really making a push with him to be like, let's translate a Maltese poem, or like, can you maybe teach me Maltese? And he was wildly disinterested and kind of uncomfortable by it, because he's not from a literary or arts background, and it just wasn't going anywhere. But he's a mechanic, he's very, handy at making things. And so we made salt dough together over Zoom. And that was maybe like the most we'd ever really deeply communicated in a very like profound way, where also I was the one kind of teaching him something. And realizing that communication again is beyond language. And I think we were talking about the bit in the book, which is one of my authors doing like a little speech about me in English, which isn't her first language. She's fluent in 4 languages, and that idea of like let's not obsess so much about perfect language or languages, and like really thinking about trans-languaging, or like that idea of gesture and bodies, and that it's really not so much about words, which is a funny thing to say as a writer or a translator. But and often people assume that I'm particular about grammar or spelling or anti-slang, and it's like couldn't be further from the truth, because it's just an interest in that messiness and the messiness of communication, and and I just love anybody that makes anything, and that's why I talk about like puppetry and other forms of making, because yes, they function brilliantly as metaphors for translation, and you can't really talk about translation without the metaphors. 15 years of trying to explain what we're doing, metaphors. It has to be metaphors, right?
I just a note on your on that passage, because I mentioned it to you earlier. This passage of a kind of live translation of a letter into English before an audience, and it's full of like unlikelihoods. It's full of wrongness in a way, of like wrong, incorrect English, but it's so in terms of some kind of standardized normative sense of what that would look like or sound like. But it's so effervescent. It's so full of energy and aliveness, and it's something that I often work in with artists who some of whom have an interest and desire in writing, for whom English is almost always their second or third language, and that relationship between that kind of pushing a difference onto English or into English, and using English as a kind of material that can be moved around and broken with, and made sort of exposed to its own kind of absurdities of correctness, which are all kind of historical and random and contingent, and that's really where I would just say to them, that's a force of creativity rather than something to close down. I just feel a note on that because I feel like that live translation just demonstrates that so beautifully. And you say at the end of it, I could have translated it for her into something more correct, but we would have missed all this poetry that was
No, completely. And going back to the idea of correctness. So your essay is an essay, memoir essay. What do you call it? Do you call it an essay, a memoir essay?
I call it a book.
A book.
Yeah. Actually, I remember being asked this. Actually, I had to, what do you write? Like on camera, what do you write? And I would come up with all these take one. I would say, well, I write translations. That was easy. And then I was searching for words for this because I didn't want to say essay for something like not that I don't believe in the essay as a form, but I just ended up with I was trying to say a book of thinking or a book of living, or I ended up with my head in my hands and just like, I don't know. But sorry, I've interrupted you.
No, because I'm often thinking about that sense of expectation before someone reads a book. So often it's if a book says on the cover it's a translation, do people go into the book with certain expectations versus if it doesn't say, that catch-22 of like, does that lead somebody on, but also isn't it better to announce and to say you're going to have to be maybe thinking and reading this a bit differently, and that might put some people off and excites other people. And I'm often thinking about that with categorising literature in general. When my novel Vehicle was coming out, Prototype, who's the publisher, they'd had feedback from booksellers saying don't put experimental on the book because it scares people. And so it got me thinking about how the importance of expectation before someone enters a book, because I felt like it would actually be terrible if I just said it's a novel, because that would crash into people's expectations of a novel. And so we compromised and it's called a verse novel. Yeah. So it's like saying it's a novel, but it's a bit, because it's not worth lying. It doesn't pay off.
That doesn't work. No.
So, in terms of your book, if say we called it an essay, and sometimes, in reviews it's called an essay or it's creative non-fiction or it's memoir essay, I suppose I wanted to ask, because the form is unusual. It's described as fragmented. It has these looping questions and answers and themes and leitmotifs and beautiful rhetorical questions that prompt you to think, and then kind of you're floating onto the next section, and the form of it is incredible. But yeah, I wanted to talk again about form, but also about voice and about humour, because I feel like there's such a strong voice throughout the book that, again, does guide you, where you feel held and you feel guided through a unique individual's idiosyncratic mind. But there is humour. I mean, you have a section called Roland Barthes rhymes with, which you open that on the contents page and it's like, yes.
It's a bit like, in that sense.
Which is, again, it's like, it's undercutting maybe expectations of what a book of philosophy and thinking is. Which I just love that kind of haha right from the beginning, which leads you throughout the whole thing. So could you talk a little bit about form, voice, maybe humour?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I mean, I think I do, maybe it's like a larger question actually that you're touching on, which is where does serious thinking, including serious thinking about politics, take place? And in what tone and in what manner? And I think something I definitely inherited from my more formal academic training was it really looks and sounds like, in a very this kind of way, in this kind of space maybe. This is where it takes place in a university context or in a seminar room, and not for example, like on a playmat with your newborn baby, and yet they're, or indeed here, actually, reckoning with the difference of another way of shaping a sentence, and knowing that you can't repeat that shape, or you could, that you need to find a way of kind of reckoning with, coming to terms with reactivating something of that in your own writing. So I do think there is a larger project at work of trying to show how I am very interested in kind of abstract thinking and large ideas. This is really, I get very excited by grand pronouncements, but I'm also really interested in trying to find places or ways of grounding them in scenes. So I think that was the case. That what I was starting to do in this little art was trying to say, okay, translation, what's going on with translation is happening in maybe in the more expected way of, here is a book, and here is someone trying to write that book again at her desk. But parts of what's going on here in terms of parts of its question to do with care and responsibility, for example, to do with the asymmetry of translation, this idea that when I translate an author, I'm responsible for them, but they're not responsible for me. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to me to speak very clearly to also the dynamic of being responsible for children, which was in that the timing of writing the Bart translations. My children were very young. And that what it feels like to be responsible for someone who is not responsible for you, also to be kind of trying, this is again, we're talking at the level of metaphor and analogy, obviously, because the stakes are different. But as a translator, every micro decision, across a text has been considered and weighed. And you can get it wrong, and you do get it wrong. There are things that you would go back. I found in your translation, in your book, in Fair, this idea of the kind of, every translation is the penultimate draft rather than the kind of final draft. But there's a sense of, you are working at it, you're trying to get it right, you're working at it, and you don't want a lapse in your attention. Mm-hmm. That actually is quite a kind of anxious position to be in. And that also spoke to me, as looking after young children, of vigilance. So it was about kind of widening the spaces and diversifying the spaces of serious thinking, of philosophizing, mm-hmm. actually. Why not? And doing politics also. So I think that was what carried across into the long form. And I feel conscious, I feel like we might be edging towards the end of our, I have just a final, I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience as well. We're going to end on some readings before opening it up to you. But I just wanted to end, it's not an ending, it's like a beginning question of the translation school that you dream of. Yeah. Because I think a translator's school would be a school. I don't want to tell you what I think. I want to know more. Like, what is it? What would be the kind of vital elements on that curriculum, and what kind of forms of action would that have on the world to found this school?
So in the book I create a kind of, or I put a placeholder for like a fantasy further education place, which would be imagining what it would be like if the whole curriculum would be translation led. So you'd have you can have an art school, which is very broad in what you might study, and then I know like in Germany there's whole writing schools and even schools for poetry. These places you can't even really imagine here. But then imagining what it would be like if everybody from day one was there to learn about translation, translatory practices. So it would be, everybody's learning foreign languages, everybody's studying the history of adaptation and how to transfer the energies between different art forms. So like phrases would be at the centre of everything. Everything you read would have been translated. Just like what does that mean? And I think it may be in the same section, that idea of, everyone would leave that school and instead of saying, oh, it's like poetry or this is like music, they'd go out and say, oh, this is like translation. And translation would be a core principle, because obviously as translators, we see translation everywhere. And you just can't help really imagining a world where that would be so key. And I mean, really, it's like a centre for communication. You know, if we go behind translation, it's the fantasy of communication being valued, and then that takes me back to how things like media studies, and I have a media degree, how ridiculed that was. And then again, that answers so many questions about why we don't have, say, something that is centred on translation or communication, because communication and being able to communicate with people in many different ways, in many different art forms, is very politicised, and is dangerous because it creates empowered people that speak to each other. And so I think that's where it comes from, that it's quite idealistic, but also seeing how simple it might be. And so next week, I'm pleased to announce I'm founding the translation school. But yeah, that kind of fantasy.
Yeah, but I think no, let's co-found it, because I think what it does is no, quite. I mean, there's a whole questions of we can go into the details of how we do. But what I love about it is the way it decenters the mono, which was in the monograph, like this sort of single authored original practitioner working on their own, and centers twiceness, two-ness, collaboration, beforeness, precedence. And rethinks, decenters originality is the criteria under which we judge. And the idea, finally, and I will go to the reading here, that there can be this idea of there not being enough space, that there can only be one. There can only be one kind of translator's account of their practice. We've already had one, Jen. Like we can't have another one. But like we've had one motherhood book, this year. Let's not have another one.
But I mean, that's
but
very
publishing
serious
works
point.
like that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, when even many years ago when I was looking for an agent, they said we've already got a translator. And yes, there is a thing of I did honestly get asked why I'm writing a book about translation, because there already is a book about translation. And it's
as if
it's
one could
so
cover
real.
that terrain.
Yeah, and it's I was saying this the other day, like as your book is an invitation to do translations, but also to write about doing translations.
Yes.
I want my book to be like that, and I think all translators that write about translation, that's just like to make more and more of them until there are hundreds of them, and people have to read them.
But I also think this idea that a topic such as translation or any form of experience could be exhausted or exhaustible. I think that, indeed, that it does work like that. Well, we've had 2 or 3 and we've done that now, rather than thinking of this as an inexhaustible.
Which you wouldn't say about poetry or literature in general. For sure. But you've just got a brand new translation.
I have, and I feel the reason I want to read this to you, and maybe to others as well, but maybe especially to you, is I feel like Hélène Bessette is your ancestor, and I'd like you to feel like you can claim lineage. Like I feel like there's a direct descent between what you're doing, maybe especially especially not only in Vehicle but across others of your books. So I wanted to kind of share that with you, and I thought I would read with Fitzcarraldo. We're making a small, limited circulation pamphlet of extracts from texts that Hélène Bessette was writing in the 1950s. I'm going to read something that will contextualise more her practice. We're publishing a small kind of chapbook of extracts from her own writings about her work as a way of introducing her work in English, but also because in France she was until recently also out of print and relatively underread or unknown writer. She only came back into print in the last 10 years or so. So wanting to, maybe a bit connected to the Helen Lowe Porter question, like what did she have to say about, she actually had a lot to say about her own work, so trying to kind of create a critical space with her own terms with this small chapbook. So I thought I would read the introduction that I wrote to this, and then to introduce Bessette, and then read the opening of Lily is Crying. And I hope you'll hear the resonance with Jen's practice and some of the things we've been talking about. So when she was in her mid-30s, Hélène Bessette, a school teacher, published her first novel. Lineated, rhythmed, and occasionally rhyming, Bessette described the style of Lily is Crying, which came out in 1953, as a sort of bonded prose poetry, never done before nor since. Lily is Crying is a short epic novel about a mother and a daughter, crushed hopes, crushed but also irrepressible lives, landscape and love in a time of war. It is, as Bessette wrote, a strange, lively, anxious mix. No, not depressing, far too clear and virile to be depressing. Bessette's early readers were quick to recognise that she was doing something different and important. Raymond Queneau, her longtime supporter and editor at Gallimard, announced on the belly band of Lily is Crying, at last something new. Marguerite Duras, writing in L'Express under the title Read Hélène Bessette, the literature that's alive for me right now is Hélène Bessette, no one else in France. Lily is Crying was awarded a prize in 1954, but despite going on to publish a further 12 novels with Gallimard, that early critical recognition never translated into sales or a livelihood. Bessette was an unenthusiastic primary school teacher. She would eventually be dismissed from her post, thus making her effectively unemployable within the French educational system. At one point, she worked as a cleaner to support her writing, herself and her sons. Bessette died in Mans in the year 2000, aged 82. Her books long out of print, her name left out of historical surveys of the modern French novel. And yet, throughout her life, she remained committed to furthering her literary practice, to her development and her research, to use her terms. Committed also to her aesthetic principles, to her influences, which ranged from Virginia Woolf, Raymond Chandler, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, to biblical psalms and Aboriginal poetry, and to the essentially democratic idea that the practice of literature is not and should not be a mysterious endeavour of the educated classes, that a civilised society should be capable of supporting its artists, indeed, that it ought to be possible for a literary innovator to make a living from her writing, regardless of, in fact, especially when there is little chance of her books finding commercial success. In 1956, Bessette co-founded with her son Eric, Le Gang du Roman Poétique, or the Gang of the Poetic Novel. This is why you belong in this. And in 1969 and 1970, she self-published 2 editions of a short-lived review titled Le Résumé, the first of which contained a short text titled Manifesto. And there's an account of her take of what the poetic novel might be. There are pieces on the writer's condition, why reach for poetry in times of war, specifically, what can poetry do to our expectations of the novel, specifically in times of war. So all of these things I feel have like strong resonance with our work. In the late 1980s, she, isolated and feeling persecuted, Bessette wrote On ne vit que deux fois, You Only Live Twice, a survey of her life and writing. And it's thanks to the immense efforts of the recently founded society, Société des Amis d'Hélène Bessette, that her complete works are now being republished in France by a small Paris-based publishing house called Le Nouvel Attila. So this is the first English translation of a work by Bessette. So I just thought I'd read the intro, where you can maybe hear some of these influences raining through. Part 1. Hell, damnation, cruelty, lies, deceit, betrayal, tears, severances, assassination, calumny, perfidy, misery, and death, says the shepherd. He's driving his sheep down the stony footpath that edges the garden beneath the ruined tower, set high on the parched, barren hillside, bleached white in the Provençal sun. Hell, damnation, cruelty, lies, deceit, betrayal, tears, severances, assassination, calumny, perfidy, misery, and death. The Mistral is up. Pale blades of wheat sweep the length of the dusty track. The serried sheep press forward, and behind them, the shepherd. Invisible rain, warm and soft, sinks into the dust, and the Mistral to carry it away. The open tower a silhouette against the low cloud hanging through it. A wind swirls, a block of wall crumbles. Lily, Lily, calls the mother Charlotte. She's wearing a straw hat trimmed with a broad black ribbon. She's coming in from the garden. The dark outline of the cypress tree, grown as tall as the heavy cloud of the tower, too close, it lords over us. She has been cutting red roses in the fat and bumping rain. Lily, Lily, where are you, Lily? My Lily. From a window embowered with plants, Lily leans out. She tries to catch her mother's eye. Here I am, maman. Her aging face, her 40-year-old face, framed by the floral window. My Lily, says the mother Charlotte. I was so afraid. I thought you were outdoors. It's about to storm. A lightning flash. Go in, Lily, go in. Don't just stand there in the frame of that gussied-up window. You were calling for me, maman. That's enough, girlie, go inside. I'm coming in now too. Crash of thunder, the low gate slammed back against the frenzied mistral, the flower-trimmed window refastened, and the rain buffeting against the window panes, the lowered blinds. Lily, fetch me a glass for these red roses. Sorry, a vase for these red roses. No, Lily, not that one, the other one, on top of the living room cabinet. No, Lily, not that one, you're not there yet. That's right, you found it. Do you know how to put flowers in a vase, Lily? My Lily, I'll leave it to you to arrange these flowers in the vase. Rumble of thunder, in the same moment, a lightning flash, the wind easing, rain splashing down, noisily, manically, frantically, ecstatically, calmed. Don't switch on the lights, Lily. You'll draw the lightning. Don't switch on the lights. Yes, maman. The bowing head of this 40-year-old Lily, her face dark against the white screen of the windows zebraed with rain, the starched curtains, long and pale. Yes, maman. Come here, Lily. Come closer, whispers the mother Charlotte. She's whispering because she's afraid of the storm. She's seated in the wicker armchair, its base softened with cushions, with Lily at her feet. My daughter, my Lily, the two of them huddled together. Thunder, lightning flashes, rumblings, crashings, clappings, distancings, the mistral let loose, the mistral stunned, choked, thwarted, lurking in the corner of bank clouds, the sky disfigured, water tromping, the fig tree in the garden bent double. Thank heavens, Lily, that you and me, you the daughter and me the mother, we love each other in life and can shelter here together in this good and gentle Provençal house. The calm hour strikes inside as outside the storm grumbles on. Why, Lily, you're crying. Why are you crying? Lily is crying, and outside the storm has moved off, the wind abated, the rain sated, the fig tree righted, but still Lily is crying.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's so good. I think, shall I just read?
Ends, you flip, not
End
end,
it,
don't
end it
end
now.
it, I mean, on your extraordinary manifesto.
So I'm just going to read. So at the end, I do like a manifesto, which is not a summary, but a kind of, in case you miss anything, I've made like a one-page manifesto, and it was actually inspired by Bernardine Evaristo's the manifesto at the back of her memoir. And I remembered today that when I briefly lived in Brighton, because I'm from Shoreham by Sea and ended up in Brighton for a bit, there was the Brighton Festival Poetry Prize, and I entered it, and she was judging it, and I got runner-up, which was like, I was like in my early 20s. And like, but I just remembered that today. It was quite a weird ceremony in the kind of like back room of a venue somewhere, I can't remember. But yeah, the manifesto. A manifesto for fair translation. I will make a fair go of learning the language I'm trying to translate. I will make a fair go of learning about the cultures of this language, its literature, its art forms, its traditions, its history, its food, its current events. I will give writing creatively and reading and writing in the forms I translate a fair go. I will ask permission from the rights holder of the original. It must be used fairly. I will make sure quotes in the original are used legally in the translation, fair use. I will treat my author fairly. I will say when I and others are not treated fairly and challenge unfair behaviour. I will be fair with myself. I will rest when I am fairly tired. I will aim for fair health. I will help make sure not every translator is homogeneously fair. I will help make sure the way translators are chosen for jobs is as fair as possible. I will not uphold that every translation must be fair and beautiful, but simply befitting. I will acknowledge if I have made a mistake. Fair cop. I will believe that it is only fair for me to challenge unnuanced criticism of my work. I will be a fair mediator. I will remember I am a worker within an industry that takes my goods to fair. I will ask for my fair share. I will fight for a fair income. I will remember that all/not all projects are fair game to me. I will expect my translations to bear my fair name. I will not expect my translations to be completely fair, blemish-free, too clean to read by a fair hand. I will make a fair piece of work. I will hope for the reader to treat me fairly and without bias. I think fair is a better judge for a translation in a manifest range of meanings. Fair as in a reasonable try. I have given translation a fair go, the way I understand it, the only way I could that didn't seem impossible at the time.